Imagine a woman sitting alone inside her car in a parking area. She has been sitting there for almost 11 minutes. Her phone rests in her hand. A message is open on the screen, and she keeps staring at it. Not because she cannot understand the words. She understands every single word clearly. She keeps staring because for the very first time in her adult life, she feels absolutely no urge to answer it. And that feeling scares her deeply, not because the message is harmful, and not because the person who sent it is dangerous, but because the woman sitting in that car suddenly realizes something about herself she has never faced before. She no longer cares, and she does not know who she is without caring so much. If you have ever sat in that kind of silence, if you have ever experienced that strange and frightening stillness, where the part of you that always rushes toward other people's pain suddenly becomes quiet, then this message is meant for you. Because what happens after that moment in the parking lot is not what most people imagine. It is not cruelty. It is not emotional damage. It is not a breakdown. It is one of the most exact and powerful psychological transformations a person can experience. And once you truly understand what it really is, you will never view it in the same way again. The first thing you need to understand is what an empath truly is underneath the label people casually use every day. That word gets used in many ways that are not fully correct. People use it to describe someone who is emotional, someone who feels deeply, someone who cries during commercials or absorbs the emotions of every room they walk into. And while those things can be true, they still miss the deeper pattern underneath it all. An empath does not simply feel more than other people. An empath builds her entire identity around her ability to respond to other people's emotions. That is the difference that matters most. It is not only about sensitivity, it is about identity. Her value becomes connected to how useful she can be to others. Her feeling of belonging becomes connected to her constant availability. Her idea of love becomes mixed with rescuing, calming, carrying, and emotionally supporting everyone around her. This is not simply a personality style. It is a psychological structure built slowly over many years, often beginning during childhood in homes where love felt conditional, where emotions were unpredictable, and where paying close attention to another person's mood was necessary for emotional safety. Most empaths do not even realize that is where it started. They only know that helping people feels natural to them. They know that understanding what others need feels automatic. Putting themselves second becomes something they do without even thinking. And for a long time, this behavior seems to work. People appreciate her. They are naturally drawn toward her energy. She becomes the person everyone calls when life becomes difficult. She listens carefully. She avoids judging anyone. She always seems patient, generous, and emotionally available. For years, that feels like love. It feels like real connection until one day it suddenly does not. There is a certain type of exhaustion that does not come from working too much or sleeping too little. It is an exhaustion that settles deep inside the chest. It is the feeling of giving every part of yourself away and then looking around only to realize the room feels empty. The people who drained your energy are nowhere to be found. The love you gave so freely did not create the connection you imagined it would create. Instead, it created dependency. It created expectations. It created a version of you that was never allowed to become tired, never allowed to need support, and never allowed to ask for anything without first giving endlessly to everyone else around you. And somewhere inside that exhaustion, something extremely important quietly begins happening. The empath begins observing more carefully. She starts paying attention not only to what people say, but also to what they repeatedly do. She starts noticing the painful gap between words and actions. She starts recognizing patterns she was once too kind and too forgiving to fully admit. The friend who only appears during a crisis. The partner who becomes gentle only long enough to pull her back whenever she tries to leave. The family member who accepts endless patience from her while offering none in return. For the first time, she truly sees these patterns clearly, and that moment of seeing changes everything. Because once someone begins seeing clearly, it becomes impossible to completely return to blindness again. This is where the psychology becomes deeply interesting, and this is also where many people misunderstand what is happening. Most people assume that when an empath starts pulling away emotionally, it means she is shutting down because of trauma. They think she has become cold, guarded, broken, or emotionally disconnected. But behavioral psychology explains something very different. What is actually happening is known as a shift in internal locus of control. For most of her life, her emotional direction pointed outward toward everyone else. Other people's emotions controlled her emotional state. Their approval controlled her self-worth. Their needs controlled her time, decisions, and energy. That is called an external locus of control. And when that system continues for too long without healthy balance or reciprocity, the nervous system slowly begins recalibrating itself. This recalibration does not move her toward cruelty. It moves her toward emotional accuracy. She slowly stops feeling responsible for problems other people refuse to handle themselves. She stops treating someone else's emotional chaos like an emergency she must immediately solve. She begins understanding the difference between what she can genuinely influence and what she has only been pretending to influence for years. That realization can feel devastating, but also freeing at the same time. Because once you realize how much energy you spent trying to repair things that were never truly your responsibility, one unavoidable question appears. What could you do with all that energy if you finally kept it for yourself? That single question changes the structure of everything inside a person's life and identity. Now, it is important to talk honestly about the guilt because without understanding this part, nothing else fully makes sense. The shift we are describing does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like failure. It feels like something inside you has become wrong. The inner voice that spent years defining your value through love, sacrifice, patience, and emotional labor does not disappear quietly. That voice begins saying painful things. It says you are selfish now. It says you are abandoning people who need you. It asks who you even are if you are no longer the one who stays and fixes everything. And for a deeply empathic person, those thoughts do not feel irrational. They feel like moral truths. They feel like responsibilities that cannot be ignored no matter how exhausted you are becoming. Choosing yourself anyway while carrying that guilt becomes one of the hardest psychological experiences a person can endure. Continuing to protect your own emotional energy while an inner voice screams that you are disappointing everyone around you can feel unbearable at times. But the guilt itself is made from old emotional programming. It was created during times when paying attention to other people's needs was not really a choice. It was a survival strategy. It was built from the belief that your value must always be earned, that your place in people's lives depends on constantly producing emotional comfort, support, and understanding for everyone else. It creates the belief that love is not something naturally given, but something you must continuously perform for an audience that expects more from you every single time. Once you begin understanding this, the guilt does not suddenly disappear overnight, but it stops feeling like a final judgment against your character. Instead, it becomes information. It shows you where healing is still needed. The empath who slowly stops caring in unhealthy and unlimited ways often enters a stage psychologists describe as ego reorganization. The old identity begins dissolving. The caretaker, the fixer, the endlessly available person slowly fades away. But before a new identity fully forms, there is a strange and uncomfortable space in between. During this time, she may feel disconnected from herself. She may feel like she is observing her own life from a distance. Sometimes she may even feel grief because a familiar version of herself is disappearing after living inside it for many years. That grief is real because something important truly is ending. Even though the old identity was exhausting and impossible to sustain forever, it still felt familiar. And the human brain often mistakes familiar things for safe things. The brain does not automatically separate healthy from familiar. It simply recognizes what it has known for years. So releasing even a painful identity can trigger the same emotional alarm inside the nervous system as losing something deeply precious. But what comes after this difficult transition is worth every uncomfortable moment that came before it. As the emotional recalibration continues, one of the first noticeable changes appears in the way she communicates. More specifically, it appears in what she no longer feels the need to explain to people around her. The empath has always been someone who explains too much, not because she lacks confidence, but because she strongly believes in understanding and connection. She believes that if she can explain herself clearly enough, patiently enough, and carefully enough, the other person will finally understand her. She believes they will finally see her intentions and maybe even match the level of care she has always given them. So she keeps trying. She explains her feelings with incredible detail and emotional intelligence. She offers context, patience, and compassion even toward the very people she is trying to explain herself to. She twists herself into complicated emotional shapes, hoping the picture will finally become clear. And then one day, in the middle of explaining, she suddenly realizes something painfully simple. Some people were never truly trying to understand her at all. Not because they are unable to see her, but because they have chosen not to. Truly seeing her would force them to take responsibility for how they treated what they clearly recognized. And responsibility is something they are not willing to carry. So they remain intentionally blind. They misunderstand her on purpose. They redirect conversations with careful precision. They turn her honesty into something to debate instead of something to respect. And every time she tried to explain herself, she unknowingly handed them more ways to defend their behavior. So eventually she becomes quiet. And the silence that follows is not weakness or avoidance. It is one of the most intentional and powerful choices she has ever made, because for someone whose main way of connecting has always been communication, silence requires extraordinary self-control. It means learning to trust her own perception without needing someone else to confirm it first. It means feeling secure in what she sees even when nobody agrees with her. It means accepting that some relationships were never built to hold honesty and that fixing those relationships is not her responsibility anymore. The silence also creates something unexpected. It brings clarity about the people around her. Because when she stops over-explaining herself, she quickly discovers who truly valued her and who was only collecting information they could later use against her. The people who genuinely care still make an effort to understand her without detailed instructions. The ones who only pretended to care reveal themselves almost immediately once her emotional effort disappears. That realization can hurt deeply, but by this point in her life, honesty matters more than comfort ever could. Now it is important to understand what healthy detachment actually feels like, because this is where many people misunderstand the entire process. When people hear the word detachment, they imagine someone emotionally numb, someone who built walls around herself because life became too painful. But that is not healthy detachment. That is emotional dissociation, and those two things are completely different. Real detachment, the kind that grows from self-awareness instead of emotional damage, feels more like watching a storm safely through a window instead of standing helplessly in the middle of it. She still notices the storm. She still understands its power. She can still feel its energy, but she is no longer drowning inside it. She is no longer pulled around by the wind or overwhelmed by the noise surrounding her. She remains emotionally aware without becoming emotionally consumed. And that small shift in position completely changes her understanding of everything around her. Moving from being trapped inside the storm to calmly observing it does not reduce her emotional intelligence. It strengthens it, because nobody can clearly evaluate something while it is dragging them underwater emotionally. Distance is necessary for accurate perception. And for the first time in her life, she finally has that distance. This is where her awareness becomes incredibly sharp, because she no longer filters every experience through the desperate need to make everything okay immediately. She no longer rushes to fix discomfort before fully understanding it. She no longer fills empty spaces in someone's behavior with generous excuses that protect them while damaging her own clarity and emotional truth. Now she sees what is actually there, and what is truly there is often far simpler than she once believed. People reveal who they are with remarkable consistency over time. The complicated part was never really them. The complicated part was her unwillingness to accept what their actions had already shown her many times before. Detachment removes that confusion completely. It allows her to take people at face value without becoming bitter or cold. If someone repeatedly shows that they only care about her feelings when it benefits them, detachment allows her to accept that reality as information instead of treating it like a personal failure. She stops creating excuses for repeated behavior patterns. She stops waiting for one unusual moment that magically changes the entire story she has already witnessed over and over again. Instead, she simply adjusts how much access that person receives based on what they have consistently demonstrated through actions rather than what she emotionally hopes for. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. And wisdom often looks distant to people who benefited from her confusion in the past. There is something else important you need to understand about what happens in other people when the empath begins changing. This is often the part that creates the most confusion and self-doubt inside her mind. When she slowly starts pulling away, when the explanations stop, when her emotional availability becomes more selective, people around her rarely accept it quietly. They resist it strongly, although not always openly. Sometimes the resistance appears in subtle ways, such as guilt hidden inside concern or passive comments, carefully designed to remind her of the person she used to be before setting boundaries. Sometimes their personal problems suddenly become more dramatic exactly when she starts creating emotional distance. That is not random coincidence. It is a recognizable behavioral pattern called reactive pressure. It happens because her withdrawal threatens the old emotional structure they relied on for so long. She was a dependable emotional resource, patient, available, understanding, and endlessly giving. Very few people willingly lose access to a resource like that without trying to pull it back first. So they begin trying again. They become softer, more attentive, more emotionally present. They briefly display the exact change she always hoped to see from them. And for someone who spent years longing for that effort, waiting for it, almost destroying herself trying to earn it through endless giving, that small glimpse feels incredibly convincing. It feels like proof that staying longer would finally have worked. But behavioral psychology shows something very important here. That temporary improvement is often not true transformation. It is stabilization behavior. It is just enough change to restore the old relationship dynamic without truly changing the relationship itself. And now, if the empath has truly grown, she can feel the difference clearly. She can sense the difference between someone sincerely growing and someone simply performing growth to maintain access to her emotional energy. That level of discernment becomes one of the most valuable psychological developments she will ever gain because it protects her without forcing her to become cynical or emotionally closed. She does not need to believe everyone is pretending. She simply needs to continue observing patiently and consistently over time. And when the behavior eventually returns to its old pattern, as stabilization behavior usually does, she quietly notices it and adjusts her expectations accordingly. She no longer creates dramatic confrontations or demands apologies and explanations. Instead, she calmly updates her understanding of that person and responds based on reality. That quiet, observation-based adjustment is completely different from the emotional reactions she once lived through. Before, she would have been devastated when someone's effort disappeared. She would have blamed herself, worked harder, and given even more of herself away trying to repair the situation. But now she feels something different, something closer to recognition. Something inside her simply says, yes, this matches everything I already understood. And then she keeps moving forward. The final stage of this transformation happens almost completely in silence. There is no dramatic announcement, no final speech, and no emotional goodbye filled with explanations. She simply stops showing up in the places where showing up always meant slowly losing herself. Not everywhere and not with everyone, but specifically in the relationships where her effort was expected while her value remained unnoticed. She stops initiating conversations. She stops maintaining connections that survive only through her emotional labor. She stops carrying relationships that never contained equal effort in the first place. And the absence she creates communicates something stronger than words ever could. Because when someone has been constantly present in your life for years, dependable, generous, emotionally available, that presence eventually becomes invisible. People stop noticing it because they begin assuming it will always be there. Like electricity or gravity, it only becomes fully visible once it disappears. And when she quietly removes that presence without drama or attention, the people who depended on it suddenly experience something they were never prepared for. They do not only experience her absence, they finally see what her presence had been doing all along. They notice the emotional weight she carried without recognition. They notice the empty spaces she quietly filled for years. They notice the grace, patience, and understanding that are no longer being freely extended toward them anymore. That sudden visibility becomes the most honest message she has ever communicated. It says everything her explanations never managed to fully express. It silently says, I was fully here for you, genuinely and consistently, and you only recognized it once it disappeared. And it also says something even deeper. It says that she is no longer willing to return to the same unhealthy arrangement. If a future relationship exists, it must be built differently, on honesty, balance, respect, and mutual care rather than emotional dependency and silent exhaustion. She never needs to say those exact words aloud because her absence communicates them with a clarity language could never achieve. And this is the most important truth underneath everything we have discussed. This transformation is not about becoming less loving. It is about learning to love accurately. It is about realizing that love without direction, without boundaries, and without discernment is not automatically virtuous. Love poured endlessly into places where nothing healthy can grow eventually becomes exhausting and self-erasing. It does not truly help anyone in the end, not even the people receiving it. The empath who reclaims her emotional energy, who chooses silence instead of endless explaining, who learns to see people clearly, and who allows herself to step away from places where her presence was never deeply valued, is not becoming less loving than before. In reality, she becomes more loving because what she offers now comes from something real and healthy. It comes from a place that is emotionally restored instead of emotionally empty. It no longer carries hidden resentment created by endless obligatory giving. It comes with true presence instead of the mechanical performance of someone who forgot how to receive love in return. She is not cold. She is not emotionally broken. She is not hardened or disconnected from life. She has simply reached a level of self-awareness so deep that many people cannot fully recognize it. She is finally free. And the people who genuinely deserve her, the ones who consistently show honesty, effort, emotional maturity, and sincere care, will immediately feel the difference because there is almost nothing more powerful than being loved by someone who has finally learned how to love themselves too. That kind of love feels clean and clear. It openly asks for what it needs. It holds standards not from pride or ego, but from self-respect and self-knowledge. It knows when walking away is the healthiest and truest choice possible. And it also knows how to stay fully, openly, and wholeheartedly when genuine love has truly been earned. You will know when you finally reach this place yourself, not because someone announces it to you, and not because some dramatic emotional moment suddenly appears. You will know because one day you will sit quietly in that parking lot, look down at the message on your phone, and feel that deep silence inside you, that terrifying but freeing silence. And instead of running from it, you will allow it to exist peacefully. You will trust it completely, and you will realize that what you are feeling is not the ending of who you are. It is the beginning of the person you were always meant to become. In the end, this journey is not about becoming distant or uncaring. It is about finally understanding the value of your own energy, your own peace, and your own emotional truth. The empath who changes is not losing their ability to love. They are learning how to love in a healthier, wiser, and more balanced way. They stop giving endlessly to places that never truly appreciated their presence, and they begin protecting the parts of themselves they once ignored. That transformation may feel uncomfortable at first, but it creates clarity, self-respect, and emotional freedom. Real love no longer comes from exhaustion or sacrifice alone. It comes from honesty, mutual effort, and genuine care. And when someone learns to choose themselves without guilt, they do not become less compassionate. They simply become whole, peaceful, and finally aligned with the person they were always meant to be.